Hey guys, what's going on? It's Louie here, and this is the only equipment guide you'll ever need. This is going to be literally the most comprehensive and detailed table tennis equipment guide on YouTube. Because of that, make sure to look at the timestamps, which if they're not showing are in the description down below. Specifically, if you don't have time to watch the whole thing, and you just want an immediate answer to what setup should I play with without any explanation, then skip to right here. But with that out of the way, enjoy the video. Now, before we dive into everything, I have two hugely important disclaimers that you need to hear. Firstly, I am going to be referencing stiffness and hardness a lot in this video. If you want an explanation on the difference between these terms, please watch my ZLC vs ALC video, which is linked in the description. Second, and more importantly, equipment doesn't matter nearly as much as anyone says it does. People focus way too much on equipment and not enough on everything else. As long as you get any decent setup from a reputable manufacturer, you are going to be okay. Equipment does not play for you, and 9 times out of 10, your equipment is not the reason you're losing. If you're hard stuck, it's almost certainly not because of the equipment you're using. So take everything I say here with a grain of salt, and note that I'll be generalizing a lot in the sense that you can almost always find exceptions to what I'm saying. For example, I just said equipment isn't the reason you're losing, but of course, there are instances where your equipment is holding you back, so there is some nuance. But one of the main purposes to this video is for if you're not sure on equipment, so that you can watch this, pick something, and never have to think about it again for a long time. With that out of the way, we're going to talk about blades, followed by varnish, followed by rubbers, glue, sandpaper, boosters, balls, robot, shoes, grip tape, and edge tape. And as I mentioned, the end of the video will feature a nice flowchart I've made that will pick a complete setup for you without all the explanation that you can use and will 100% be good enough for what you need to go and play. Proper table tennis rackets are not some all-in-one thing that comes pre-assembled. You can get pre-assembled rackets, but if you want to start playing properly, you'll almost certainly want a custom setup. What this means is buying a blade, which is just the wood, and then buying 2 sheets of rubber which you glue to the blade. The first reason for this is that rubbers are not very durable, while the wood will last for years and years. If you get a pre-assembled racket, the rubbers are super glued onto the wood, making them next to impossible to remove. That means once the rubbers are dead, you have to throw the whole setup away. But if you get a custom setup, you can take the rubbers off and change them out every few months. The second reason is pre-assembled rackets are normally aimed at recreational players and don't offer the spin, speed, sweet spot, or stability that a custom setup will get you. The blade you pick is by far the most important part of your setup. Since it is something that you very rarely need to replace, it's important that it doesn't become redundant. There's 2 main types of blades: all wood blades and blades that include some sort of synthetic material. Most decent table tennis blades are actually several layers of material, not just a single ply of wood cut into the shape of a paddle, although those do exist. You'll see nomenclature like 3+2, 5-ply, 7-ply, 5+2, and so on when looking at blades. The first number is the number of wood layers, and the second number is the layers of synthetic material. So for example, a 3+2 blade would have 3 layers of wood and 2 layers of some synthetic material like carbon fiber. A 5-ply or 5+0 blade would mean an all-wood blade with 5 layers, and so on. The innermost layer is the thickest layer and is referred to as the core. The outermost layer is the surface and is what makes contact with the rubber. The core and outermost layer will always be wood, and the total blade composition can at most be 15% synthetic material, while the other 85% must be wood. Generally speaking, all wood blades are known for offering better control and feeling. They give a natural solid response with lots of vibration that produces tons of feedback for the player. On the other hand, composite blades are generally stiffer and faster than their all wood counterparts and have a much more dampened vibration. A major benefit of synthetic fibers is that they offer a large sweet spot without sacrificing weight or thickness. In other words, blades that take advantage of a synthetic material offer a larger area on the paddle where you can still get optimal power. In contrast, a small sweet spot means you have to hit pretty close to the center every time. Generally speaking, offensive players prefer blades with carbon fiber. However, there's no right or wrong answer here, and it comes down to preference. Some players love the dampened feeling of synthetic materials, and others like the vibration and feedback from all wood. For what it's worth, there are always exceptions to the norms, so there are fast wood blades, soft blades that use synthetic materials, and so on. There are a lot of factors that impact how a blade performs, and it can get pretty complex. While I won't dive too deep into every single factor, here's a general overview. Firstly, different woods offer different weights, stiffnesses, hardnesses, and feelings. For example, balsa is extremely lightweight and soft, which makes it popular for defensive blades because it allows for more control and dwell time, and on the other hand, a wood like kiri is more dense and often uses the core layer in offensive blades. Like wood, different synthetic materials also significantly affect the hardness, stiffness, and feeling of a blade. The most common types of carbon fiber composites are ZLC, which is a Xylon carbon composite, and ALC, which is an airlite carbon composite. I already have a detailed video breaking down the differences between these two fibers, so if you're interested, check it out in the link that's in the description. Beside these, there are types of non-wood materials that don't even include carbon, like cellulose nanofiber, which provide a unique balance of sweet spot, strength, and flexibility. The placement of the fiber, the arrangement of wood layers, balance, weight, thickness, and handle size/material are all other things that can directly impact a blade's playing characteristics. If you want a complete breakdown of how each material type impacts a blade's playing characteristics, or what materials make up a specific blade, most manufacturers have pretty detailed explanations on their websites. For example, if I go to Yola's site and click on the Nobulus PBO-C, it shows me that this blade is a 3+2 setup, it has a kiri core, and it has hinoki on the outer layers, with PBO-C as the in-between layer. Then I can go to blade specifications and see an explanation that hinoki is a softer wood with a very unique touch, and there's even a blog page that shows that PBO-C is just a fancy name for ZLC. If you really want to go crazy looking at the exact material characteristics, I would highly recommend checking out the site SDC Handmade Blades from Sergio, as he's got a section dedicated to going over the technical specifications of just about every common material used in a table tennis blade. He also goes into details on things you normally wouldn't think about, like the way materials are layered horizontally versus vertically, among other things. To further illustrate how materials can directly impact playing characteristics, I'll use my current setup as an example. I'm currently using Butterfly's Mizutani Super ZLC blade. This is an extremely hard and stiff setup that uses Super ZLC, a very high performance carbon fiber composite. This is a 5+2 setup with a kiri core, followed by a layer of limba, followed by a layer of Super ZLC, followed by another layer of limba. Now, let's look at the Haramoto Interforce Super ZLC. It's also a 5+2 blade, has a kiri core, and has layers of Super ZLC and limba. So it must feel similar, right? Nope, completely different feeling. On the Haramoto, the Super ZLC is the layer directly next to the core, instead of being directly under the surface, and before the top layer of limba, there's also a layer of Aeus, which is less dense than limba. The Haramoto is also slightly thicker and has a larger head compared with the Mizutani, yet maintains the same weight. Now, while these may seem like small differences on paper, the Haramoto feels significantly more flexible and also slightly softer than the Mizutani. So as you can see, seemingly minor or negligible differences can seriously impact the way a blade performs. So the elephant in the room and the million-dollar question is, what blade should you pick? And it depends. If you're planning on continually developing your game, especially if you're planning on improving fast, it is crucial to pick a blade that won't become redundant, and this is for a couple of reasons. Let's say you pick a very slow all-wood blade because you're just learning and you want something controllable, but you're planning on training very often to improve fast. Eventually, you're going to need to upgrade to a faster blade, and all the feeling you have developed for your slow blade will be totally gone, meaning you'll have to relearn your touch again with a different setup. Blades last a really long time and are really expensive, so why put yourself in a situation where you're going to have to upgrade? The blade is extremely important, but you can think of the rubbers like training wheels. And again, I know I haven't gone over rubbers yet, but it makes more sense to start with a high quality blade from the get-go and use some slower, less springy rubbers while you're learning, and then eventually upgrade to higher performing rubbers than it does to pick a slow blade and be stuck in a situation where you're using super hard rubbers you can't control on touch shots because they're too springy. I want to note that the blade section of this video specifically is one where you can certainly find an exception to some of the things I'm saying. For example, I'm sure there are coaches who, instead of putting their most rapidly improving students on an optimal setup to begin with, do start them on the slowest all-wood blades imaginable, and I'm sure these students also turn out just fine. And while this isn't what I would do personally as a coach, for the reasons I just explained, it doesn't make other coaches' approaches or ideas invalid, as it comes down to preference and or coaching style. So for some things, there's just no objective correct or incorrect answer. Just like how, in a similar vein, when I was talking about blades, I mentioned most pros use carbon fiber, but you can always find an exception in the sense that there are pros who also use all wood. Key takeaway is that, as with most things, there's nuance, and equipment doesn't matter as much as you think, so don't overthink it. To reiterate, where I treat the rubbers as training wheels and put you on an optimal blade from the get-go is for those players who are training a lot and planning on very quickly improving their standard. If this is not you, if you're not planning on extreme development of your game, for example, maybe you do want to improve a bit, but you're not planning on playing all the time, or you just want a solid competitive setup with control, or if you're just looking to play recreationally and you just want something stable and good enough to be respectable, then it is more reasonable to pick something like a slower all-wood setup. It is all situational and all depends, but hopefully that gives a good rule of thumb. If you're trying to understand a blade's properties before purchasing and the materials aren't listed, just look at how the manufacturer classifies it. All around minus will be just about the slowest blade you can get other than the defensive blade, and offensive plus will be just about the fastest you can get. You can also go to sites like RevSpin, which will give a very general idea of a blade's characteristics if you're not sure and there's no reviews out for it. If you're looking at things like Butterfly's blade matrix, make sure to be very careful when interpreting this chart. For example, when it says higher vibration property, this means a faster vibration, which actually means there's less vibration in terms of how it feels to our hand. So in other words, the lower the vibration property, the more vibration a blade will have, as counterintuitive as that sounds. Couple more notes on blades before we move on. There's different sizes and shapes as it relates to the head size and handle. For example, the octagon or heptagon, depending on how you look at it, head has recently been popularized by Trolls Morgard, and there's nothing illegal about this. As it relates to handles, some are thicker, some are straight, some are flared, some are anatomic, and there's also specifically made blades shaped to be comfortable for the different styles of penhold players. As a final note on blades, if your handle is really uncomfortable, where it feels like it's cutting into your hand as you play, or it's too sharp, you can sand it until it's comfortable, and this really won't harm anything. With blades out of the way, let's talk about rubbers. Some of you may know that I have an older video on my channel where I talk about why good rubbers, quote unquote, suck. And I want to note that I still stand by the advice I gave in that video. However, because this section is going to cover everything that was mentioned in that video, I've gone ahead and made it unlisted. If you really want to watch it, where my technique is terrible by the way, then it is linked in the description below. A rubber is made of two parts, the top sheet and the sponge. The top sheet will either be inverted, which means it's got a smooth surface and pimples or pips connecting to the sponge, or pimpled with the smooth side connecting to the sponge and the pips facing outward. Regardless of whether a rubber is inverted, the pips can have a significant impact on how a rubber performs. Things like the length, width, thickness, and spacing between the pips all have an impact on a rubber's playing characteristics. To avoid confusion, anytime I mention pips or pips players from now on, I'm specifically referring to players who use a pimpled top sheet. Most players use inverted rubbers on both the forehand and backhand because the top sheet will have much more friction, allowing for the generation of massive spin. Pips players are common at a club level, but quite rare at a professional level, although some pros do use them. The most common type of pips are long pips, which are very slow and generally reverse the spin given by your opponent. This makes them great for defensive players. Short and medium pips can be used a little more aggressively, and when these rubbers are used for attacking shots, they come at the opponent with a very high velocity but less topspin than inverted rubbers. This can make them very difficult to deal with if the player using them is exceptionally skilled. There are also players that use pips to block, for deception, and so on. There are many styles of pips players, way too many to go over in one video, but to summarize, a pimpled rubber will have less spin than an inverted one. Pimpled rubbers also generally have a much thinner sponge under the top sheet than inverted rubbers, and sometimes have no sponge at all. Just to throw in a quick fact, an all-wood blade where both sides have no sponge short pips is called a hard bat. It's basically a throwback to the early days of table tennis, and there are even hard bat only tournaments that are a lot of fun to play. Hard bat paddles make for a slower, less spinny style of gameplay, and you have to be exceptionally skilled to play with this type of paddle well. There's also a similar classification called sandpaper, which generates even less spin than hard bat, and both hard bat and sandpaper styles have niche followings and offer a unique and enjoyable way to experience table tennis. Now with inverted rubbers, you either get a top sheet with friction or anti-spin. Anti-spin is somewhat similar to long pips. The rubber can't really produce any spin on its own and almost plays like a sheet of glass. It can be great for players with limited movement to give an opponent a very hard time, but since it's so rare and not optimal in most circumstances, I'm not going to go into detail about it here. So focusing only on non-anti-spin rubbers, let's talk about tackiness. If you don't have anti-spin, your top sheet will either be very tacky, slightly tacky, or grippy but not tacky at all. Tacky rubbers literally have a sticky surface that can pick up the ball. They tend to be more forgiving on serves, touches, blocks, etc., but when it comes to faster strokes like looping, they require a very high level of precision. In other words, they are quite unforgiving on faster shots unless you have proper coaching and technique. On the flip side, non-tacky rubbers may not be literally sticky, but they're still extremely grippy, like how a car's tires still grip the road without being sticky, and they can still generate a lot of spin due to this grippy surface. These rubbers are less forgiving on the touch shots, so your short touches, serves, etc., meaning you'll need better control on these sorts of strokes, but they are much more forgiving on loops, allowing for easier and more variable strokes with great spin and power. While there are a few exceptions, almost every pro will either use a non-tacky or slightly tacky backhand rubber, but there's a much bigger split when it comes to the forehand. Just about every Chinese national team member uses very tacky rubbers on the forehand, but many European and Japanese players use grippy or slightly tacky rubbers instead. Neither is objectively better, it just comes down to preference and style. However, unless you are extremely advanced with proper technique and coaching, I would recommend avoiding tacky rubbers due to their difficult and demanding nature on the larger strokes. When it comes to the sponge and overall rubber technology as a whole, you'll notice that manufacturers have developed advanced technologies that go by names like spring sponge, hyperbounds, and so on. I collectively refer to these as your modern rubbers. These modern rubbers are under very high tension and work kind of like a trampoline. When you hit the ball, the rubber compresses and then springs back to give your shot extra power. You also have what I'd call old school inverted rubbers, which are structurally similar to the newest technology, but don't have as prominent of a trampoline effect or aren't under as high of tension. The older generation or more entry level a rubber is, the more you'll notice a difference. While these old school rubbers might not give you as much power, they can offer more control and feeling, making them a good option for developing players. Another factor to consider is the hardness of the rubber. This refers to how firm the rubber is when you compress it. This is completely independent of technology or springiness that I was just talking about. In other words, you can have old school rubbers that are hard and new generation springy rubbers that are soft. Harder rubbers are typically faster because they don't compress as much, which means less dwell time on the ball and more direct energy transfer. Softer rubbers, on the other hand, are slower but give you more control, as they have more dwell time, meaning the ball stays on the racket a fraction longer, allowing for more precision. As I briefly mentioned earlier, you can also adjust the thickness of a rubber. A thicker sponge generally offers more spin and speed, as the extra sponge absorbs more energy and then releases it back into your shot. However, this can make it harder to control, especially on touch shots. A thinner rubber will provide less speed and spin but offers more control, and again you can even get some rubbers with no sponge at all. If you loop really aggressively with a thin sponge or a sponge that's extremely soft, you'll be at risk of bottoming out your rubber, where it compresses all the way down to the blade, and then you basically end up hitting the ball with the wood, which would seriously hinder that shot's performance. The dirty secret manufacturers don't want you to know is that almost all rubbers come from the same factory, and two rubbers from different brands will many times be almost identical. Butterfly makes their own rubbers, as does DHS, but almost every other rubber is made in the same factory in Germany. These rubbers are collectively called ESN or tensor rubbers. Yola, Exium, Jewo, Stiga, Donic, Yasaka, T-Bar, and Andro all make their rubbers in the same factory, and while they all have different marketing gimmicks, if you match up the hardness, sponge, top sheet technology, thickness, etc., you'll basically be getting the exact same rubber just with a different logo on it. Because Butterfly and most, but not all, of DHS's rubbers are made independently, it's often hard to switch from a non-ESN rubber to an ESN one and vice versa, or from Butterfly to DHS and vice versa, due to them using completely different technology, resulting in different feelings and characteristics. Also, if you're comparing hardness, it's important to note that all ESN rubbers use one scale, Butterfly uses their own scale, and DHS also uses their own scale. So a 50-degree Exium rubber and a 50-degree Yola rubber are the same hardness, but a 42-degree Butterfly rubber is not the same hardness as a 42-degree Tensor rubber. So, do good rubbers suck? No, but also yes. I'm going to go over what I mentioned in my old video on this topic, but I'm going to word it a little bit better. I cannot tell you how many times I've seen beginner to intermediate players go out and buy really expensive, I'm talking $80 to $100 rubbers, specifically rubbers like this one and this one. They go out, they buy these expensive rubbers, they put them on their paddles, they think it's going to be this super great rubber, and then they put the rubber on, they start playing, and they're surprised when they don't feel immediately better with the rubber. They don't see any immediate improvement, and if anything, they put these really high-end rubbers on, and that actually makes their game feel worse. There's a very specific reason for that. Rubbers, like every other piece of your equipment, are not going to play for you, they are not magic, and you have to be a pretty good player to handle the rubbers that pros say are good. What you have to understand is that high-level competitive players and pros alike say that certain rubbers are good for very different reasons than what a beginner or intermediate player is looking for in a rubber. In other words, what's good for a professional player like Timo Boll is not always going to be the same as what's good for you. So, let's take this beautiful brand new sheet of Tenergy 05 Hard. Timo Boll seems to love this rubber on his forehand, so it's gotta be a good rubber for everybody's forehand, right? Wrong. These new high-end rubbers like Dignix, Dynarize, Omega 7, DNA, Evolution, etc. are very springy, and it's actually that new technology that's been driving up the price of rubbers. It costs a lot more money to manufacture these rubbers that are under so much tension, that are springier and harder, and now we're seeing 50, 55, and even 60-degree sponges, and that's what's been driving up the price. It doesn't necessarily mean because it's more expensive it's better for you, it just means that it's more expensive to make. So don't be fooled by the price of these rubbers thinking, oh, they're really expensive, so it must be better. It's better for really good players, but for most people it's actually going to be worse. Now I'm going to explain why a harder, really springy rubber isn't what you want, especially if you're a beginner or even an intermediate level player. Let's take the example of Timo Boll and Tenergy 05 Hard again. Why does Timo Boll like this rubber? Well, he's a world-class player, and that means he's got world-class touch or world-class feeling. And what that means is he's got the ability to use his hands to manipulate the ball to get it to do pretty much anything he wants. You play a ball anywhere on the table, and he's got the ability to get it to bounce 10 times on your side and come back toward the net. He's just got that good of ball control when he's making contact. He's got good wrist and soft hands, so he can pretty much manipulate the ball to do whatever he wants it to do regardless of the equipment he's using. So of course he's going to love a rubber like Tenergy or Dignix because it gives him the extra power that can give him a slight competitive advantage away from the table where he needs it, and he doesn't care about the hard springy sponge maybe giving him slightly worse touch because he's good enough to counteract that. He's good enough to have good touch on his own regardless of the springy sponge. So all he cares about is that extra power when he's swinging hard or away from the table, and that extra springiness that feels really good to loop with. But if you take your average player or your beginner player and you give them a sheet of any of these springy or hard rubbers, all they're going to find is that they end up popping up the ball more, so the touches, pushes, and serves that were all once short and low to the net are now going to be a little bit looser. You're going to get the ball looped past you more, and everything will just feel slightly more sloppy. So it just makes the overall experience of playing a little bit harder because the ball is off your rubber pretty much as soon as you hit it. It has very little dwell time, which makes it difficult to play with. For your high level or pro players, every single small advantage you can get makes a very, very big difference in a sport where points are often determined by millimeters and milliseconds. They need that slight extra bit of power, that slight additional spin generation when they're looping. Just these small margins can literally be the difference between winning and losing. But for your average Joe, you put this higher end rubber on your paddle, and there's a good chance you might not even notice the difference between it, and even if it does feel slightly better when you're looping or when you're away from the table, it's not going to be worth the offset or the trade-off of now losing all your touch close to the table and pretty much losing whatever short game control you might have had. So this does beg the question of at what point is it okay to get away with switching to these higher end rubbers where you're going to be able to control it, and at what point do you still need to not really be using these rubbers yet? So where's the line? And I'd say if you're at about 1800 on the USATT scale, around that level or higher, with good coached technique, then maybe you would be okay with one of these higher end springy rubbers. If you're not at 1800 yet, so you're not really at the level where in a match you can serve underspin, they push long to your forehand, and you know how to loop the crap out of the ball and play aggressively. If you're not at that point, you're going to be much better off saving your money and getting something a little tamer. I want to mention an extremely important nuance here. When you're looking at rubbers, you can almost always get a softer version of a manufacturer's flagship high-end rubbers. So like you can get a 43 degree version of a rubber with hyperbounce instead of going for the harder 50 degree version, but this defeats the whole purpose and will still be difficult to control on touches because the sponge by definition is still very springy using the latest high tension technology, even if it's a little softer. But regardless, it's still as expensive as the harder version, and as a beginner, you won't see any benefit. So until you're at a point where you're actually ready for this technology, don't even bother spending your money on the softer versions of a flagship line. Just find the previous generation if you're intermediate, or the entry-level rubber if you're a beginner. For example, with Exium, Omega 7 would be considered a flagship line with the latest high-tension sponge technology. And if you're advanced, you'd be fine with this because you can handle the touch and then just pick whatever hardness is right for you. But if you're intermediate, go with Omega 5, which is the generation before Omega 7 with a slightly less springy sponge. And if you're a beginner, go with Vega, which is the entry-level line with an even less springy sponge. And then you can grow into the springier sponges and more sophisticated technology as you improve. So as an example to illustrate this, let's say you're improving fast. Again, key point, you feel you've had a serious jump in skill, and you're currently using Vega Europe, which is a very soft entry-level rubber, and you get to a point where it's holding you back. Next time you change rubbers, maybe try Vega Asia, which uses similar technology but is a little bit harder, and then so on from there. Now let's say it's way in the future, and you've improved to an advanced level, your touch and feeling is exceptional, and let's say you like the hardness of the Vega Asia, but again, it's seriously holding you back. At that point, it's time to move to something higher end like Omega 7. And now let's say you're on the Omega 7 Asia, but you want something softer as a personal preference. Well, now would be the time where it makes sense to go to a softer version of the flagship. So maybe go from Omega 7 Asia to Omega 7 Euro. Because at that point, where you're extremely advanced, going back down to something like Vega would hinder you too much, even if it's the same hardness on paper as the flagship version, because it doesn't have that same modern technology. As a final note on rubbers, please make sure to take care of them. That means cover them when you're not using them and store them at room temperature. Do not store your paddle in a hot car, the garage, or anything like this, or else the rubbers will oxidize, losing all their grippy properties. Also make sure to clean it in one way or another. Dust and particles building up over time will negatively impact performance. In fact, you'll often see players clean their rubbers every couple points or so because of the ball dust building up over time. Your breath and shirt/hand will work fine, but there's also things like cleaners you can purchase for use after a playing session that help remove dust from the rubber and improve its longevity. In terms of knowing when to replace a rubber, basically just take a ball, push it into the rubber with some force, and try to slide it. And if the ball slides, it's probably time to replace the rubbers. But if the ball grips and kind of spins, and I'll have a video on screen now illustrating what I mean, then you're probably fine. Also, just look at the rubber. If you have an inverted rubber and the pips are really showing through the top sheet and it almost looks translucent, it's probably time to replace that rubber. As a rule of thumb, if you're playing a couple times a week, you should probably replace the rubber every few months or so. Now, in terms of a total blade rubber setup, I mentioned this briefly earlier, but to reiterate, as a coach, if I have a beginner who I know is planning to become very competitive and improve quickly, I'll normally put them on a pretty fast/high quality blade and then just start them off with low end rubbers. This may seem counterintuitive, but this way from the get-go, they're getting used to the feeling of the wood they'll be using for a long time, and the rubbers can be thought of like training wheels. As they improve, the rubbers get faster, but there's no need to suddenly adjust to a dramatically faster blade at some point, which could be detrimental. If they do end up changing to an even higher end setup in the future, it also means that adjustment won't be as difficult. This also saves money in the long run, as it allows you to not have to continuously purchase marginally faster setups with each improvement, and instead just upgrade the rubbers. Alright, let's talk about glues. This is not going to be a guide on how to glue or assemble your setup, as there's plenty of videos that cover this already. This is simply an explanation. In the past, players used what's known as speed glue, which was loaded with VOCs, which stands for volatile organic compounds. This type of glue gave the rubber a huge boost in speed and spin, but came with some significant health and environmental concerns. As a result, speed glue was and still is completely illegal, and today all table tennis glues are water-based, making them safer and more environmentally friendly. When it comes to gluing your rubbers to the blade, there are two main types of glue to choose from: glue sheets and liquid glues. Glue sheets are pre-cut adhesive films that make the process fast and easy. I personally recommend using liquid glue that you apply yourself. Not only does it give you more control over the adhesion, but it also tends to create a better bond between the blade and the rubber, allowing for more consistent performance. Now, most players will find that applying one good layer of glue on both the blade and rubber is enough to achieve a solid bond. This works well for the majority of recreational and competitive players. However, if you're playing at a higher level or using techniques like boosting, which I'll cover in just a bit, you might need to use multiple layers of glue. This is also true if the glue you're using is particularly thin and doesn't provide enough adhesive strength with just one layer. In those cases, 2, 3, or even 4 layers might be necessary to ensure the rubber stays firmly attached and performs at its best. Just about any glue should be fine, but make sure you read the reviews of whatever glue you get, and please use table tennis glue. Elmer's glue or any non-table tennis glue will absolutely destroy your setup. As a final point on glue, the best glues will actually easily peel off the rubber when you remove them, making it easy to re-glue your rubber multiple times if needed without damaging it. Lower quality glues won't peel, or it won't peel very easily, meaning if you messed up your gluing process or just need to re-glue your rubber, you're going to have a very difficult time peeling the old glue off, potentially destroying your sponge in the process. Varnish or lacquer is something that you can apply to the surface of the blade to seal it, which protects it over time. For example, it can prevent the blade from tearing itself apart when you remove the rubbers. Varnishing a blade has a negligible, if any, effect at all on the feeling of the ball, so there's really no reason not to do it. Some blades will come pre-varnished from the manufacturer. Whether or not to varnish the handle is another question and comes down to personal preference. Some people say by sealing the handle, it prevents sweat from getting into it and changing the weight over time. Some say the varnish makes the handle feel way too slippery and uncomfortable. Personally, I apply an extremely light layer of varnish on my handle, but it really doesn't matter either way. Now I'm going to very briefly cover boosting. Let me emphasize up front, unless you are a very advanced player, you do not need to boost. In fact, for most players, boosting can cause way more problems than benefits. Boosting is a technique where you apply a substance called a booster to the sponge of your rubber to increase its elasticity. This results in more spin and more speed, giving your shots almost like a super trampoline effect. However, it's a delicate process that requires precision and a deep understanding of your equipment. If you're just starting out or playing at an intermediate level, boosting isn't necessary, and frankly, you shouldn't even consider it. The performance benefits of modern rubbers are more than enough without any additional treatment. In addition, boosting severely reduces the lifespan of your rubber, so if you're on a budget, it's going to be a lot more costly for you. That being said, if you're at an advanced level and you do want to boost, I personally recommend the Falco Long Booster. It's reliable, but there are other good boosters available as well, like Haifu and Janchi. Each booster has slightly different characteristics and can last for varying amounts of times, so you'll need to experiment to find the one that works best for you. A word of caution, boosting can be risky. Doing it incorrectly, or even doing it perfectly and just getting unlucky, can cause your rubber to bubble, which will completely ruin it. One other crucial thing to note is that many flagship tensor rubbers and DHS rubbers, if it says NIA on it, often come with a pre-applied layer of booster from the factory. It's very easy to spot because the sponge will look slightly glossy or oily. When it comes to gluing and boosting, something else that's often overlooked is that glue and booster make a huge impact to the weight of your setup. If the total weight of your setup is around 190 grams, this is starting to get heavy. Over 200 grams and it'll feel like you're playing with a brick. So be careful because a setup that's too heavy or balanced poorly will be hard on your wrist and your body as a whole, and it'll also just make you slow. Since I'm on the subject of weight, most manufacturers will list the average weight of their blades when you view them, and the thicker and denser your rubbers, the heavier they'll be in general. Just about any blade and rubber setup with a single layer of glue, even at max thickness rubbers on both sides, should be under 190 grams with a few exceptions, but again be careful with the glue and boosting because the weight can go up very fast. Now let's talk about the type of ball, and this one's pretty straightforward. The most important thing is to make sure the ball you're using is 40 plus and from a reputable manufacturer. The 40 plus means it's the official size and is made from plastic, which replaced the older celluloid balls designated as 40 without the plus at the end. And celluloid balls play very differently to the plastic balls and are not tournament legal anymore. You'll notice that balls are rated by stars, with 1-star balls typically being used for training, and 3-star balls normally being considered tournament quality. The difference mainly comes down to consistency and bounce, roundness, and durability. A 3-star ball is going to give you a reliable, high-level performance, but if you're just training or doing some drills, a 1-star ball can do the job perfectly fine at a much lower cost. Even though different brands of 3-star balls might feel different, sometimes very different at first, you will get used to whatever you're playing with after a short period of time, so if you switch to a new ball, give it a week or so, and you'll quickly adapt to the new feel. A quick and very important tip, if you have a tournament coming up, find out what ball they're using and buy some in advance and start practicing with that specific ball a few weeks beforehand so you can adjust to how it plays. This way, when you show up on tournament day, there won't be any unpleasant surprises. If you're still watching, I honestly can't believe it, but I appreciate you, and this is a quick reminder to make sure to drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying this content. And also, if you're interested in some free coaching, join my Discord server, which is linked in the description for information on that. We've got a couple more topics to cover. Next up, let's talk about table tennis robots. These can be a fantastic tool for practice, but they're what I'd consider a double-edged sword. If you already have solid technique and you know what you're doing, robots are a great way to get consistent, repetitive practice without needing a training partner. They can help you drill your shots, improve your footwork, and keep you sharp. However, if your technique isn't quite right, robots can actually do more harm than good, because a robot allows you to hit the same shot over and over, and so if your form is incorrect, you'll just be reinforcing bad habits and ingraining them into your muscle memory. So, make sure your technique is solid before relying heavily on a robot for practice. As for the robots themselves, of course, the higher end models with advanced features like spin variation, oscillation, and ball frequency control are amazing tools, but they can also be really expensive. If you're on a budget, there's no shame in getting something more affordable like an iPong or a similar entry-level model. These can still give you great practice and consistency for your drills without breaking the bank. But all in all, if you have a club you can go to and real people to practice with, a robot, while nice at times, is totally unnecessary. Last couple bits of equipment I'd like to cover are shoes, grip tape, and edge tape. You ideally need to get a pair of shoes specifically designed for table tennis. Because the footwork can be so intense, you need something with good lateral support. Just about every reputable table tennis brand makes a good pair of shoes. Mizuno also makes some great shoes for table tennis. If you absolutely have to, things like volleyball shoes and badminton shoes can also be adequate. Edge tape goes along the edge of the racket and can protect the rubber and wood from chipping over time. It does add a little bit of weight and can impact the balance, but it's such a minor difference that it's negligible. You can also put grip tape along the handle, which, along with helping grip, can change the balance of the setup in the opposite direction. I'd say edge tape is totally up to personal preference, but advise against grip tape unless you really need it, since it adds a buffer between your hand and the blade, reducing your feedback. Do not take this as me saying that grip tape is bad and you should never use it. It's not going to make or break your game either way, and those are just my 2 cents. Holy crap, you actually made it to the end. Or maybe you just skipped here, and that's totally fine too. If you don't care about all the details and just want a setup recommendation, this is the part for you. Now, let me preface this by saying that the flowchart app I've created is insanely simple, and that's by design. It only asks for 3 things: your skill level, your playing style, and whether you're on a budget. Based on those criteria, it will give you a solid recommendation for both blade and rubber. I do not want to hear questions like, why didn't it recommend this? Or, isn't this better than what you suggested? Or, could I use this instead? The answer is sure, you could find other options that would also work, but I guarantee that if you go with what the flowchart recommends, you'll be set. You'll be able to play, improve, and not worry about your equipment for a long time. It's really not that complicated, and you'll get used to whatever you play with as long as it's decent quality. All the recommendations from this app are for butterfly blades just to keep it simple, but if you prefer another brand, especially if you're on a budget, you can easily find an equivalent. Just match the specs as closely as possible and you'll be good to go. The link for this flowchart is down below. If it's something you're interested in, go ahead and check it out, and hopefully it's useful for you. And with that, we have wrapped up the most comprehensive table tennis equipment guide on all of YouTube. I hope this video gave you all the insights you need to confidently choose and understand your equipment, whether you're a beginner just starting out or an advanced player fine-tuning your setup. As I mentioned earlier, remember that while equipment is important, it's really not everything and not nearly as important as most people make it out to be. Focus on your technique, strategy, and training, especially your physical training, and you'll see real improvements in your game. Make sure to check the description for any pertinent links I mentioned. If you have any questions or feedback, make sure to leave a comment down below. And if you enjoyed the video, I am begging you, please give it a big thumbs up. This is one of the most time-consuming videos I've ever made, so your support means the world, especially if you want to share this with friends or family or anyone you think might be interested in this sort of thing. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching, and until next time.